My husband filed for divorce right after my father died, thinking he was entitled to half of the $4.5 million that had just hit our joint account. He smirked in the middle of the funeral reception, boasting about his pregnant mistress and his newfound wealth, completely unaware that in his absolute greed, he had just legally chained himself to a predatory commercial loan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to let a toxic person dig their very own grave. We were gathered in the formal dining room of my family's sprawling estate in Buckhead, Atlanta. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and the low murmur of Atlanta's black elite, all dressed in their finest morning attire to pay respects to my father Elias. He had built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up, and today was supposed to be about honoring his legacy. I sat quietly at the edge of the long mahogany table, nursing a cup of chamomile tea, my mind still heavy with the fresh grief of burying the only man who had ever truly loved me. That was when a heavy manila folder slammed down onto my lap, nearly spilling my tea across my black dress. I looked up to find my husband Malik standing over me. His posture was arrogant, his expensive custom suit tailored to perfection, though I knew his credit cards were quietly maxed out to maintain that illusion. We had been married for 6 years, and for the last two, the distance between us had grown into a cold, impassable void. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of what he chose to do on the day I laid my father to rest. Sign them. Malik demanded, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the surrounding relatives. I filed for divorce this morning. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my knees, then slowly looked back up at his smug face. You filed for divorce today? I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden pounding in my chest. You could not wait a single week. Why wait when the timing is this perfect? Malik sneered, leaning in closer so his words could land with maximum impact. I saw the alert on my phone. $4.5 million hit our joint banking account yesterday afternoon. You were sloppy, Jasmine. Because you deposited that inheritance directly into a shared account, you legally commingled the funds. Under Georgia law, that makes it marital property. I am taking my 50%, and I am moving in with my girlfriend. She is 6 months pregnant with my son, the son you were always too busy to give me. A heavy silence fell over our end of the dining room. Extended cousins and family friends averted their eyes, pretending to inspect their catered plates, while the people who should have defended me did the exact opposite. My mother Vivian sat elegantly at the head of the table. She was a woman who valued country club status and flawless appearances above all else. Instead of reprimanding the man who had just humiliated her grieving daughter, she took a delicate sip of her Chardonnay and let out a long, disappointed sigh. Well, I cannot say I am entirely surprised, Vivian remarked, her voice dripping with condescension. If you spent less time staring at spreadsheets and doing tax math for those local salons, and more time actually keeping your man happy, he would not have to look elsewhere to build a family. A woman has to know how to keep a home, Jasmine. You always lacked that basic grace. My older sister Jocelyn chimed in with a cruel laugh. She had always been the golden child, the one who lived rent-free in our parents' properties, while pretending to be a successful real estate mogul. It is true, Jocelyn said, tossing her perfectly styled hair. You drove him away. You cannot expect a successful tech sales manager like Malik to stick around when his wife acts like a glorified human calculator. Her husband Spencer leaned against the doorframe. Spencer was a white finance bro who loved nothing more than lecturing black women about generational wealth and corporate strategy, despite the fact that his own career was propped up entirely by my father's connections. He chuckled, swirling the bourbon in his crystal glass. You have to admit, Jazz, it is a brilliant legal maneuver. You are supposed to be the brilliant forensic accountant and wealth manager, right? You went to Spelman College, got all those fancy financial certifications, and yet you made the ultimate rookie mistake. You commingled inheritance cash. Honestly, it is embarrassing. Malik is well within his rights to claim his half. That is just smart business. I looked at the four of them. My cheating husband. My status-obsessed mother. My resentful sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law. For years I had played the role of the family scapegoat. I had endured their insults, paid for their mistakes, and allowed them to minimize my career consulting for major corporations as just doing basic taxes. They desperately needed me to be the failure so they could feel like successes. Malik tapped his expensive watch. I do not have all day, Jasmine. My lawyer is waiting for the signed acknowledgement of service. You can fight me in mediation for the house, but I am taking my 2.25 million out of that account by the end of the week. Sign the papers. Any other woman might have broken down. Any other daughter might have screamed at her mother for the profound betrayal or thrown her tea in her husband's face for his infidelity. But the grief of losing my father had burned away whatever remaining tolerance I had for these people. My father and I had spent the last year of his life preparing for exactly this kind of behavior. We knew their greed would eventually blind them to reality. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly picked up a pen from my purse, clicked it open, and flipped to the signature page of the divorce filing. I signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I closed the folder and handed it back to Malik, offering him a warm, pleasant smile that caused him to hesitate for a fraction of a second. You are absolutely right, Malik, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent dining room. That money hit the joint account yesterday, and it is entirely marital property now. You are legally entitled to your full 50% share. I wish you and your new family the absolute best of luck with it. Malik snatched the folder from my hand, his chest puffing out with victorious pride. He thought he had just broken me. He thought he had just secured a lifetime of unearned wealth. He turned on his heel and marched out of the mansion, heading straight for his leased Maserati, parked in the circular driveway. I watched him through the large bay windows as he drove away, speeding down the road toward what he believed was financial freedom. My mother shook her head in disgust, muttering about how I had always been weak, while Spencer patted Jocelyn on the shoulder, already discussing how they were going to spend their own incoming inheritance. I simply went back to sipping my chamomile tea, letting the warmth soothe my throat. None of them had bothered to look closely at the banking alerts. None of them had bothered to ask why a massive lump sum was deposited on a random Thursday before the probate court had even processed my father's will. Malik was rushing to his pregnant mistress, practically salivating over $2.25 million. He had no idea that the money sitting in our joint account was not an inheritance at all. It was a brutal high-interest commercial bridge loan, and by filing those divorce papers and legally claiming the account as marital property, my cheating husband had just officially assumed joint liability for $4.5 million of predatory corporate debt. The next morning, the sprawling Buckhead estate was suffocatingly quiet. The caterers had cleared away the remnants of my father's funeral reception, leaving behind an echoing emptiness in the marble hallways. I sat at his antique oak desk in the study, boxing up his personal fountain pens and breathing in the faint, lingering scent of his cedarwood cologne. My phone had been silently illuminating with increasingly frantic automated alerts from the commercial bank, indicating Malik had officially initiated the withdrawal process for the $4.5 million. He was sealing his own financial coffin right on schedule. But my moment of quiet reflection was abruptly shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps and loud, obnoxious laughter echoing through the foyer. Jocelyn and her husband Spencer paraded into the study without bothering to knock. Spencer was wearing crisp khaki golf shorts and a pastel polo shirt, his standard uniform, when he wanted to project the image of a wealthy Southern gentleman taking the weekend off. He swung a titanium 9-iron casually back and forth, knocking over a stack of my father's architectural magazines with the club head. He did not even bother to apologize or pick them up. Jocelyn trailed right behind him, holding a silver measuring tape and pointing at the intricate crown molding. She was already mentally redecorating the room, stripping away every piece of our father's legacy to replace it with her own sterile, tasteless aesthetic. I watched them quietly folding a silk pocket square into a cardboard box. Are you two lost? I asked, my voice perfectly even. The reading of the physical assets is not until next week. Spencer chuckled, leaning heavily against my father's desk and looking down at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He had always loved playing the benevolent white savior to our black family, constantly inserting himself into spaces he did not earn. He reached out and actually tapped the top of my head with the rubber grip of his golf club, a condescending gesture meant for an obedient dog, not a 32-year-old forensic accountant. Do not worry your pretty little head about probate schedules, Jazz Spencer said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. Jocelyn and I already spoke to the estate lawyers this morning. We are officially taking over your dad's company and this house by assuming the corporate liabilities right now. We bypassed the waiting period entirely. I know you just do taxes for those local beauty salons down on Peachtree, so all this high-level corporate transition stuff is probably making your head spin. But do not stress. I am going to set up a little monthly allowance for you out of the company operating accounts. Nothing crazy, but enough to keep your lights on. It takes real aggressive business acumen to run an empire, and frankly, you just do not have the killer instinct for it. Jocelyn stepped forward, snatching the silver measuring tape back and placing her manicured hands on her hips. She looked around the study with absolute greed shining in her eyes. It is just the natural order of things, Jasmine, she chimed in, her voice carrying that familiar grating entitlement. Dad always knew I was the visionary of this family. I have the charm, the connections, and the big picture mindset. You were just his little assistant running numbers in the background and fetching his coffee. It is fine that you are ordinary. We need ordinary people to do the grunt work. But an empire requires a queen, and Spencer is the perfect king to help me expand it. I looked at my sister, a woman who had failed her licensing exams 4 times and who had lived entirely off our father's generosity her whole adult life. She genuinely believed her own delusions. She believed she had built the very walls she was currently standing inside. They had rushed to sign the assumption of liability papers to lock me out of the physical real estate, thinking they were staging a brilliant corporate coup. They thought they had outsmarted the quiet sister who sat in the background staring at spreadsheets. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind Jocelyn that I was a Spelman graduate managing offshore wealth for corporate executives while she struggled to balance a basic checking account. I simply smiled, a warm, genuine smile that stretched from ear to ear. I slowly closed the cardboard box I had been packing and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my black skirt. Congratulations, Spencer, I said, my tone perfectly pleasant and entirely devoid of the anger they were desperately hoping to provoke. Taking over the entire commercial portfolio overnight is quite the power move. You must be very proud of your aggressive business acumen. Spencer puffed out his chest, swinging the golf club again. Like I said, Jazz, it takes a killer instinct. You just have to know a good deal when you see it. I picked up my purse and slung it over my shoulder. It really is a fascinating portfolio. I continued walking slowly toward the heavy wooden doors of the study. By the way, Spencer, did you happen to read the Phase 2 environmental soil report on the industrial park you just assumed total legal ownership of? Spencer froze mid-swing. The smug smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second before his massive ego overrode his common sense. He let out a loud, dismissive laugh, waving his hand in the air. Oh, please do not try to throw big environmental compliance words at me to sound smart. I know all about standard soil tests. It is just bureaucratic red tape meant to scare off amateur investors. We will grease the right palms at the city zoning office and have it cleared by next month. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals, Jazz. I offered him one last pitying look, stepping out into the cool marble hallway. I am sure your killer instinct will handle it beautifully, I replied. I turned and walked toward the front entrance, leaving them standing proudly in the study. Spencer was still laughing, telling Jocelyn how pathetic it was that I was trying to use fake corporate jargon to scare them. But his laughter was suddenly cut short by the harsh mechanical screech of the heavy iron estate gates being forced open. Through the massive glass windows lining the front foyer, I watched as a fleet of 6 matte black government SUVs sped up the long, winding driveway. They swerved aggressively onto the manicured lawn, tearing up the expensive imported grass my father had planted just last spring. The heavy vehicles slammed into park, forming a tight barricade around the front perimeter of the house, preventing anyone from leaving. The doors flew open in unison. More than a dozen agents stepped out wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers. Emblazoned across the back of their jackets in bright, bold yellow letters was the acronym EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency had arrived. They did not knock. They began setting up caution tape and bright orange environmental hazard markers directly across the front limestone steps. One of the lead federal agents carrying a thick metal clipboard marched straight toward the double mahogany doors. Behind me, I heard the golf club slip from Spencer's hands and clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor of the study, followed by Jocelyn's sudden terrified gasp. The fluorescent lights of the Atlanta mediation office hummed with a quietness matching the cold leather chair beneath me. I sat across the mahogany conference table from the man I had spent 6 years calling my husband. Malik arrived exactly 15 minutes late, wearing a tailored navy suit and a smirk, suggesting he had won the lottery. He settled into his seat, running a hand over his haircut, while his attorney, a loud man named Richard, slapped a stack of demands onto the table. I remained still beside my counsel, a seasoned financial litigator named Marcus. Richard leaned forward, folding his hands with a patronizing grin. He launched straight into a rehearsed speech about equitable distribution and Georgia marital property laws. Richard declared that since the $4.5 million had been deposited into our joint checking account, it was legally commingled. He demanded that I immediately authorize a wire transfer of $2.25 million to an escrow account controlled by Malik. Richard added that Malik was being generous by not going after my private accounting firm provided I signed over his cash by 5. Malik leaned back, checking his reflection in his dark phone screen. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. He told me to just sign the transfer authorization. He reminded me his pregnant girlfriend was currently shopping for nursery furniture at high-end boutiques in Buckhead. He told me holding on to his money made me look like a bitter, jealous ex-wife. He said I should focus on doing taxes for salon clients and let him step into the real wealth he deserved. I let him talk. I let him bask in his delusion of unearned prosperity. I looked at the man who had slept in my bed while secretly building a life with someone else. He genuinely believed his own narrative. He believed he had outsmarted a forensic accountant who managed offshore portfolios for executives. I turned my head and gave Marcus a small nod. Marcus calmly opened his slim leather briefcase and retrieved a single document printed on thick ivory paper. He slid it across the smooth surface of the conference table until it stopped directly in front of Malik and his attorney. Richard picked up the paper as his eyes scanned the first few paragraphs. I watched the arrogant confidence completely drain from Richard's face. His eyes darted back to the top of the page. "What is this?" Malik asked, his voice losing its cocky bravado as he looked at his suddenly silent lawyer. Malik snatched the paper from Richard's hands and began to read it himself. The realization hit him incredibly hard. The document was not a notification of inheritance. It was a finalized commercial contract for a hard money bridge loan. The principal amount was exactly $4.5 million. The interest rate was a predatory 22%, compounding monthly. The most important detail was the name of the borrowing entity listed at the top. The loan had been secured exclusively under Malik's Technology Sales LLC. "You took out a loan!" Malik stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "You took out a massive loan in the name of my business. That is illegal. I never signed this. I never authorized any of this. This is fraud, Jasmine. I will have you arrested." Marcus finally spoke, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. He informed Malik there was no fraud involved whatsoever. He reminded Malik of a general power of attorney document he had voluntarily signed and notarized 3 years ago when he went on a business trip to Dubai. Malik had explicitly given his wife full legal authority to execute financial decisions on behalf of his LLC in his absence. He had simply forgotten to revoke it. I had utilized that exact legal authority to secure the bridge loan. Richard tried to interject, arguing that Malik was not responsible for a loan he did not personally negotiate. But Marcus cut him off with surgical precision. Marcus pointed out the exact wording in the divorce filing that Richard himself had submitted to the court just days ago. Malik had legally and aggressively claimed the $4.5 million in the joint account as marital property, demanding his equitable half. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into Malik's terrified eyes. I explained that by claiming the cash as his marital property in a sworn court document, he had formally assumed 100% of the liability for the associated debt. The money was never an inheritance. Malik, I said, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. It was always a high-interest liability. Because you rushed to divorce me and claim what you thought was my father's money, you just adopted a $4.5 million predatory debt. Malik stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. He looked at Richard for a lifeline, but his lawyer was already packing his briefcase, clearly realizing his client was now completely insolvent and unable to pay his legal fees. His words were cut off by the sudden aggressive buzzing of his cell phone resting on the table. The screen lit up, displaying the name of his pregnant mistress. He answered the call, putting the phone to his ear. Even across the table, I could hear her shrill, hysterical screaming pouring from the speaker. She was standing at the checkout counter of a luxury Prada boutique in Phipps Plaza. She shrieked that the cashier had just declined his black card. She yelled that she tried 2 other platinum cards, and both had been immediately frozen for suspicious corporate debt activity. She was currently being humiliated in front of the entire store. Malik lowered the phone slowly, the sound of his mistress's public embarrassment still screeching into the quiet mediation room. He looked at me, his face a mask of absolute financial ruin. The $2.25 million he thought would fund his new life was nothing but an illusion. He was leaving this marriage with a staggering unpayable debt that would bankrupt him before his child was even born. I simply stood up, pushed my leather chair in, and walked out of the room, leaving him to drown in the shallow grave he had dug for himself. The lead federal agent stepped over the marble threshold of the estate without waiting for an invitation. His heavy combat boots left dull scuff marks on the pristine imported Italian tile my father had meticulously selected. The agent did not acknowledge my presence in the hallway. He marched directly toward the open double doors of the study, where Spencer and Jocelyn stood paralyzed in absolute terror. Spencer had completely lost his arrogant Southern gentleman facade. His face was entirely drained of color matching the pale pastel fabric of his designer polo shirt. Jocelyn backed away from the entrance, her manicured hands trembling as she clutched the silver measuring tape to her chest. The agent stopped in the center of the study and unclipped a thick stack of legal documents from his metal board. He asked if Spencer and Jocelyn were the current legal owners of the industrial park property bordering the eastern riverfront. Spencer opened his mouth, but his voice cracked, leaving only a pathetic squeaking sound hanging in the quiet room. He nodded his head once in a jerky mechanical motion. The agent did not offer a polite smile. He stated that his team had been conducting a covert multi-year investigation into the specific acreage they had just officially acquired. The agent explained that the property was not a prime commercial real estate development opportunity. It was an active Class 1, illegal toxic dumping site. He elaborated that highly corrosive industrial solvents and prohibited manufacturing runoff had been deliberately buried under the soil for over a decade. The agent pulled a pen from his tactical vest and pointed to the highlighted section of the top document. He informed them that the Environmental Protection Agency had just formally classified the land as a federal Superfund site. Spencer stumbled backward until his hips hit the edge of my father's heavy mahogany desk. He stammered out a weak defense, claiming they had just assumed ownership of the corporate entity this morning and could not possibly be held responsible for decades of prior environmental negligence. He tried to laugh, his signature condescending chuckle, but it sounded hollow and desperate. He told the federal agent there had to be a mistake because they bypassed the probate court specifically to secure clean corporate assets. The agent remained completely unmoved by the pathetic display of wealthy white entitlement. He flipped to the second page of the file and read the legal statutes aloud. He explained that by deliberately signing the expedited assumption of liability paperwork to seize control of the real estate portfolio, they had legally absorbed every single existing corporate penalty attached to the land. The agent stated that ignorance of environmental law did not grant immunity from federal prosecution. He handed the thick stack of papers directly to Spencer. He announced that the Environmental Protection Agency was officially levying a mandatory cleanup penalty and criminal negligence fine against their newly assumed corporate entity. The total amount due was exactly $12 million. The agent added that the fine was payable within 30 days, and failure to comply would result in immediate asset seizure and federal prison sentences for the listed corporate officers. The tactical team began taking photographs of the study, documenting the assets inside the estate, while Spencer stared blankly at the $12 million figure printed on the federal notice. The reality of his aggressive business acumen finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. The agents turned and walked out of the house, leaving the yellow caution tape fluttering across the front steps. I stood silently in the hallway, watching the total destruction of their arrogant corporate coup the second. The heavy front doors clicked shut. Spencer's entire demeanor violently shifted. The polished liberal facade he wore to impress my wealthy black family vanished completely. He turned his dead, furious eyes toward my sister. Jocelyn tried to reach out to comfort him, whispering that they could hire lawyers to fight the federal charges. Spencer violently slapped her hand away, causing her to stumble backward into a bookshelf. He stepped toward her, his face twisted in raw, unfiltered rage. He screamed that she was a stupid, incompetent failure who had intentionally tricked him into signing a corporate suicide pact. He yelled that her father was nothing but a criminal slumlord who built his empire on toxic garbage. Spencer stripped away every ounce of his fake progressive charm. He degraded her intelligence, mocking her 4 failed real estate licensing exams and telling her she was nothing without his white validation. He shouted that he had lowered his standards to marry into a wealthy black family, only to be saddled with a $12 million federal debt. Jocelyn shrank against the dark wooden shelves, crying hysterically, as the man she thought was her perfect king verbally destroyed her. She begged him to calm down, promising she would fix the disaster. Spencer grabbed the collar of her designer silk blouse, his knuckles turning white. I told her she was too stupid to fix a parking ticket, let alone a federal environmental crisis. He ordered her to call her status-obsessed mother immediately. He demanded that Vivian force me to liquidate my private offshore portfolios to bail them out of the $12 million penalty. He screamed that I owed it to the family to save them from bankruptcy because I was the only one with actual liquid capital. Spencer shoved Jocelyn aside and stormed out of the study, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably on the imported rug. He stomped past me in the hallway, refusing to make eye contact as he fled toward the garage. I did not offer my sister a single word of comfort. I simply turned and walked out the back entrance, heading toward my car. I knew exactly what was coming next. My phone remained silent for the rest of the afternoon, while the panic undoubtedly infected the entire family network. The inevitable demand arrived precisely at 8 that evening. My phone screen illuminated with an urgent message from Vivian. My mother did not ask how I was handling the grief of burying my father just 24 hours ago. She then simply sent a strict command, ordering my immediate presence at the estate for a mandatory family dinner tomorrow night, to stage a financial intervention and force me to surrender my private wealth to them. The long mahogany dining table in the formal estate was set for 3. The silver candelabras cast long shadows against the silk wallpaper, casting an ominous glow over my mother Vivian. She sat at the head of the table wearing a stiff emerald green dress, her face tight with a desperation she tried to hide behind a mask of authority. I took the seat opposite her, resting my leather purse on the empty chair beside me. The house was eerily silent following the federal raid earlier that afternoon. Jocelyn and Spencer were nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in their borrowed luxury vehicles trying to escape the reality of their $12 million crisis. Vivian did not offer me anything to eat or drink. She skipped the pleasantries entirely. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the imported table, and demanded that I liquidate my offshore portfolios immediately. She told me it was my duty as a daughter to bail my sister and brother-in-law out of their federal disaster. She insisted that I had hidden away a massive fortune over the years doing my accounting work, and that it was time to step up and act like real family. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life placing me second. I asked her why I should empty my retirement accounts to save a man who had mocked my career just this morning and a sister who had failed everything she ever touched. Vivian slammed her hand onto the table, telling me that family sacrifices for family. She told me I was selfish for holding on to my money while Jocelyn suffered. She went on a furious tirade claiming I had always been cold and disconnected. She said that my rigid personality was the reason my marriage fell apart. She looked me dead in the eyes and admitted she had known about Malik's pregnant mistress for 8 months. My mother confessed that she had actually encouraged Malik to pursue the affair because she felt sorry for him. She said I was too boring to keep a successful man anyway, and that Malik deserved a woman who knew how to cater to his needs. She admitted she had invited his mistress over for afternoon tea while I was out of town at corporate conferences. The sheer audacity of her betrayal did not break my composure. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the toxic venom she was spewing. My own mother had actively helped my husband build a second life simply because she resented my quiet independence. She justified her betrayal by claiming I was a failure as a wife and therefore I owed it to the family to be useful as a bank account. She demanded I transfer my assets to Spencer by tomorrow morning to clear the environmental penalties. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out a single manila envelope. I slid it slowly across the polished mahogany surface of the dining table. The thick paper made a soft scratching sound until it stopped exactly an inch from her emerald green dress. I told her I would not be transferring a single dime to Spencer or Jocelyn. I added that I was entirely done making sacrifices for people who actively plotted my destruction. I instructed her to open the envelope. Vivian scoffed, rolling her eyes as she pulled the document from the folder. She assumed it was some meaningless legal threat, or perhaps a minimal check I was offering as a compromise. Her eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page. The color completely washed out of her face. Her hands began to tremble violently as she read the eviction notice printed on the crisp white paper. She looked up at me, her voice barely a whisper. She asked what kind of sick joke this was. She reminded me that this was her house, the mansion my father had built for her. She stated she had marital rights to the property, and no eviction notice could possibly be valid. I smiled, folding my hands neatly on the table. I explained the financial reality she had been too ignorant to notice over the past 2 years. I told her that the estate was not paid off. I revealed that my father had quietly remortgaged the entire Buckhead property to a private holding company to secure capital for his failing commercial ventures. He had stripped all the equity out of the mansion, leaving it completely encumbered by debt. The bank did not own the mortgage anymore. A private corporate entity did. Vivian argued that it did not matter. She claimed Jocelyn and Spencer had assumed all the corporate liabilities and assets this morning, making them the owners of the house. She said Spencer would just cancel the eviction. I shook my head slowly, shattering her last remaining delusion. I explained that Spencer and Jocelyn only assumed the commercial real estate firm, the one holding the toxic industrial park, and the massive federal penalties. The private holding company that owned the mortgage on this specific mansion was a completely separate legal entity. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands. I told her that my father had transferred total ownership of that specific holding company to me 18 months ago. I revealed that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of the very entity that held the debt on the roof over her head. Because the mortgage had been in default for 6 months, I was legally executing my right to foreclose and evict the current occupants. I watched my mother realize that her entire world had just collapsed. She had traded her loyalty for a cheating son-in-law and a bankrupt golden child, leaving herself completely at the mercy of the daughter she had deemed too boring to love. I stood up and pushed my chair back. I told her she had exactly 48 hours to pack her bags and vacate my property before the sheriff arrived to forcibly remove her from the premises. Vivian began to sob loudly, pleading with me to be reasonable. She begged me not to throw her out onto the street. She cried that she had nowhere to go and that Jocelyn and Spencer were completely broke. I walked toward the dining room exit, not bothering to look back. 48 hours expired at exactly 9 in the morning. I pulled my vehicle through the open iron gates of the Buckhead estate, followed closely by a private security detail I had hired for the occasion. The sprawling manicured lawn was completely empty, but the heavy mahogany front doors were deadbolted from the inside. I stood on the limestone steps and inserted my master key into the lock, but it refused to turn. Vivian had called a locksmith to change the locks on a property she no longer legally occupied. I signaled my security team to stand back as the front door swung open, just a crack, held secure by a thick metal chain. Vivian peered out, her face contorted into a mask of defiant rage. She wore a silk morning robe and held her phone tightly against her chest. She informed me that she had done her research online and was officially claiming squatters' rights. She stated that I had no legal authority to remove her without a prolonged court battle, and that Jocelyn and Spencer had moved their remaining belongings into the guest wing to establish residency. I did not argue with her absurd legal theories. I simply looked at my watch and noted the time. Vivian sneered and held up her phone, announcing she had already dialed 911 to report a hostile trespasser. She intended to have me arrested on the front porch of my own property. I nodded encouragingly and told her to make sure she requested officers who specialized in corporate property disputes. Within 10 minutes, the flashing blue and red lights of 2 Atlanta police cruisers illuminated the driveway. 4 officers stepped out, approaching the porch with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Vivian threw the door open, completely abandoning the metal chain to rush out and put on the performance of a lifetime. She wept hysterically, clutching the arm of the lead officer, telling him that her estranged, abusive daughter was trying to illegally force her out of her marital home. Spencer and Jocelyn emerged from the foyer, standing behind Vivian with identical expressions of arrogant triumph. Spencer told the officers to remove me immediately, citing his non-existent status as the head of the household. The lead officer turned to me, his expression stern, and asked for my identification. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved my driver's license, along with a thick bound folder bearing the official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. I handed the documents to the officer, speaking in a clear, measured tone. I explained that there was no domestic dispute happening today. I stated that I was the chief executive officer of the private holding company that held the defaulted mortgage on this exact address. I directed the officer to the second page of the folder, which contained a fully executed expedited foreclosure decree signed by a federal judge just yesterday afternoon. The document explicitly waived any squatter's rights due to the commercial nature of the corporate entity currently holding the deed. The officer read the paperwork carefully, his eyes scanning the raised seals and notarized signatures. He handed the folder back to me and turned his attention to Vivian. The sympathetic expression he had worn moments ago vanished entirely. He informed my mother that the documents were ironclad and that she was currently trespassing on private corporate property. He stated she had exactly 20 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings she could carry before his officers would physically remove her and her guests from the premises for criminal trespassing. Vivian gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. She looked at Spencer, demanding he use his aggressive business acumen to stop the police. Spencer simply stared at the officers, his face flushing a deep, angry red, realizing his white privilege held zero weight against a federal judge's signature. Jocelyn began to panic, screaming that 20 minutes was not enough time to pack her designer wardrobe. The lead officer pointed to the door, telling them their time had already started ticking. The next 20 minutes were a blur of absolute chaotic humiliation for the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. My private security team handed them heavy black plastic trash bags, refusing to allow them to take any of the antique luggage that belonged to the estate. I stood on the lawn watching as Spencer shoved crumpled pastel polo shirts into a garbage bag, cursing under his breath. Jocelyn dragged 3 bursting plastic sacks across the marble foyer, her expensive heels slipping on the polished floor. Word had quickly spread through the exclusive neighborhood. Several luxury cars slowed down as they passed the front gates, their wealthy occupants rolling down their tinted windows to watch the spectacular downfall of the once prominent family. Vivian stood on the sidewalk, trembling with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment as her wealthy country club friends witnessed her standing next to a pile of garbage bags. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. She asked how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own flesh and blood. I walked down the steps, stopping just a few feet away from her. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the nosy neighbors could not hear our private conversation. I asked her if she remembered a cold, rainy night exactly 16 years ago. I reminded her of the I was 18 years old when she threw my meager belongings onto the wet pavement because I refused to surrender my small college savings fund to pay for Jocelyn's credit card debt. You locked the doors and told me I was a useless burden who would never amount to anything I said, looking directly into her eyes. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, Mother. You are finally experiencing the exact same grace you showed me. Later that same evening, miles away from the affluent brightness of Buckhead 3, desperate people gathered inside a cheap, dimly lit motel room. Spencer and Jocelyn sat on a stained mattress surrounded by their plastic trash bags. They stared across a wobbly laminate table at Malik, whose suit was now entirely rumpled. Bound by their mutual financial ruin and a shared hatred for me, they began plotting a massive corporate heist to steal my wealth. The iron gates of the Buckhead estate stood open when I arrived. The humid Atlanta air felt suffocating as I parked, avoiding the tire ruts left by federal utility vehicles. I walked up the limestone steps and pushed open the mahogany doors. The interior of the mansion was silent, stripped of vibrant energy. The crystal chandelier was turned off, casting shadows across the marble floor. I made my way toward the formal dining room, where my mother was waiting. Vivian sat alone at the head of the polished dining table, wearing a stiff emerald green designer dress. Her face pulled tight with desperate anxiety behind a mask of maternal authority. The silver candelabras cast a flickering glow, highlighting dark circles under her eyes. There was no food prepared. The massive mahogany table was entirely empty, except for her phone. I pulled out the wooden chair at the opposite end and sat down, resting my leather briefcase beside me. My mother skipped the pleasantries, demanding that I liquidate my offshore investment portfolios by tomorrow morning. She stated, "It was my fundamental duty as a black daughter to bail my sister and brother-in-law out of their federal disaster," she insisted. I had selfishly hoarded a massive fortune doing forensic accounting, while the rest of the family struggled to maintain elite social standing. She told me it was time to step up and act like real family. I looked at the woman who had spent 32 years placing me second to my older sister. I asked her why I should empty my retirement accounts to save a white man who had openly mocked my career, and a golden child sister who had miserably failed at everything. Vivian slammed her hand onto the table, raising her voice, telling me family always sacrifices for family. She called me arrogant and selfish for holding on to my millions. She went on a furious, bitter tirade claiming my analytical nature was the reason my husband filed for divorce. She looked me dead in the eyes, proudly admitting she had known about Malik's pregnant mistress for 8 months. The sheer audacity of her confession hung heavy in the dark, dimly lit dining room. My mother confessed that she had encouraged Malik to pursue the affair, feeling sorry for him being trapped in a marriage with someone obsessed with spreadsheets. She smiled a cruel, twisted smile, admitting she had invited his mistress over for afternoon tea right here in this house while I was out of town attending finance conferences. Vivian justified her ultimate betrayal by claiming I was an absolute failure as a wife, and therefore I owed it to the family to be useful as a bank account, she demanded. I authorize a wire transfer of exactly $12 million to Spencer's legal team by tomorrow morning. The toxic venom she spewed did not break my composure. I sat still, absorbing the horrific reality that my mother helped my husband build a second life, simply because she resented my financial independence. I reached into my briefcase, pulling out a thick manila envelope. I placed it flat, sliding it slowly across the mahogany surface until it stopped an inch from her green dress. I told her I would not be transferring a dime to Spencer or Jocelyn. I added that I was done making sacrifices for people who plotted my destruction, instructing her to open the thick envelope. Vivian scoffed, rolling her eyes, pulling the document from the folder, assuming it was some meaningless legal threat or a minimal cashier check offered as a pathetic compromise. Her eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page. The remaining color washed out of her face. Her hands began to tremble violently, reading the formal eviction notice printed on crisp white paper. She looked up at me, asking what kind of sick joke this was. She reminded me. This was the luxury mansion my father built. For her, stating she had marital rights to the property, and no eviction notice could possibly be valid against a widow. I smiled, folding my hands, explaining the financial reality she had been too ignorant to notice over the past 2 years. I told her the Buckhead estate was not paid off, revealing my father quietly remortgaged the property to a private holding company to secure capital for his failing commercial ventures. He stripped all the equity out of the mansion, leaving it completely encumbered by debt. The local bank did not own the mortgage anymore. A private corporate entity did, Vivian argued frantically. The debt did not matter, claiming Jocelyn and Spencer assumed all corporate liabilities yesterday morning, making them legal owners of the house, she said. Spencer would cancel the eviction notice. I shook my head slowly, shattering her last remaining delusion, explaining Spencer and Jocelyn only assumed the commercial real estate firm holding the toxic industrial park and federal penalties. The private holding company owning the mortgage on this specific mansion was a completely separate legal entity. I leaned forward, telling her my father transferred total ownership of that specific holding company to me 18 months ago, revealing I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of the very entity holding the debt on the roof over her head. Because the mortgage had been in severe default for 6 straight months, I was legally executing my absolute right to foreclose and evict the current occupants. I watched my mother realize her entire world had just collapsed. She had traded her maternal loyalty for a cheating son-in-law and a bankrupt golden child, leaving herself at the mercy of the daughter she deemed too boring to love. I stood up, pushing my wooden chair back, telling her she had 48 hours to pack her bags and vacate my property before the county sheriff arrived to forcibly remove her. Vivian began to sob loudly, pleading with me to be reasonable, begging me not to throw her out onto the street, crying she had nowhere to go, and that Jocelyn and Spencer were completely broke. I walked toward the dark dining room exit, my footsteps echoing loudly against the polished hardwood floors, not bothering to look back at the desperate woman who completely shattered our family, leaving her to drown alone in the absolute silence of her ruined mansion. The interior of the surveillance van parked 3 blocks away from the Midtown Hotel was completely dark, except for the glowing monitors. I sat silently wearing a pair of heavy headphones, listening intently to the crisp audio feeding directly from the penthouse suite on the 50th floor. The hidden cameras I had installed hours earlier provided a flawless high-definition view of the trap I had carefully laid. Spencer, Malik, and Jocelyn paced nervously around the luxurious living area, waiting for the mysterious corporate buyer to arrive. They had absolutely no idea. They were standing in the middle of a fabricated reality. Spencer rubbed his hands together, letting out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed through the suite. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the Atlanta skyline. He puffed out his chest, telling Malik that they had finally done it. Spencer boasted about how incredibly easy it was to outsmart a naive little tax girl, he said. I was too emotional to ever protect my digital assets properly, claiming that Black women in finance always left gaping security vulnerabilities because they relied too heavily on affirmative action instead of raw corporate intelligence. Malik nodded eagerly, entirely willing to throw his own wife under the bus just to secure a fraction of white validation. He stood near the expensive leather sofa, gripping his briefcase tightly. Malik chimed in, agreeing with Spencer, calling me an arrogant little girl who thought reading spreadsheets made her invincible. He bragged about how he was going to take his cut of the $3 million payout and immediately wire it to an offshore account to hide it from the divorce courts. He laughed, imagining my face when I realized my entire high-net-worth client roster had been sold to my biggest corporate competitor. Jocelyn sat on the edge of an armchair, complaining about the humidity in the room and the cheap quality of the hotel water. She rolled her eyes, telling the men they needed to hurry up and secure the bag so she could go shopping to replace the designer wardrobe she left behind during the eviction. She gloated about how she was the true mastermind of the family, claiming Dad would be proud of her for showing such aggressive initiative. She completely ignored the fact that she was currently participating in a federal crime. The heavy double doors of the master bedroom inside the suite slowly creaked open, drawing their immediate attention. A tall, elegant woman wearing a sharp gray suit walked into the living area. Her back was turned to them as she moved toward the executive desk, positioned near the window. She sat down in the high-backed leather chair facing away from the trio, resting her hands on the armrests. Spencer immediately stepped forward, putting on his fake charismatic Southern gentleman persona. He introduced himself as the primary broker of the transaction. demanding the $3 million wire transfer be initiated before he handed over the stolen encrypted hard drive. He spoke with incredible condescension, telling the woman in the chair that she was extremely lucky. He decided to bring this proprietary data to her hedge fund instead of selling it to the highest bidder on the open market. Malik stepped up right beside him, pulling the small silver hard drive from his pocket. He placed it firmly on the edge of the glass coffee table, tapping it twice. He told the woman that every single piece of my private offshore account data and elite client contact information was stored right there, ready for her to exploit. He smiled a greedy, desperate smile, asking how quickly the funds would clear their accounts. The woman, sitting in the high-backed leather chair, let out a slow, soft chuckle. She placed her hands on the desk and casually spun her chair around to face them. Spencer, Malik, and Jocelyn instantly froze, the color draining completely from their faces. The woman sitting across from them was not the ruthless hedge fund chief executive officer they had spent weeks communicating with online. She was Sylvia, the senior law partner at my firm and my most trusted corporate mentor. Sylvia smiled warmly, leaning back in the chair, intertwining her fingers. She looked at the three terrified people standing in front of her and asked why they looked so surprised. She explained in a calm, steady voice that the massive rival hedge fund they thought they were selling stolen data to simply did not exist. She revealed that the entire competing corporation was nothing more than a dummy shell company I had set up 3 years ago specifically to catch corporate spies and trap greedy relatives looking for an easy payday. Spencer began to hyperventilate, his eyes darting frantically around the hotel suite, searching for an exit. Malik stumbled backward, knocking his knee against the glass table, shouting that this was a setup and they needed to leave immediately. Jocelyn grabbed her empty designer purse, her hands trembling so violently she dropped it onto the carpet. Sylvia raised a single finger, commanding them to stay exactly where they were. She picked up the small silver hard drive from the table, holding it up to the light. She told them that the IT technician they thought they had so cleverly bribed worked directly for my internal security team. She explained that the encrypted drive they were trying to sell did not contain a single byte of my client roster or financial data. Sylvia placed the drive down and plugged it directly into her laptop. She informed them that the drive actually contained a highly sophisticated Trojan horse virus. She revealed that the moment Malik and Spencer had plugged the device into their own computers earlier that afternoon to verify the stolen contents, the virus had silently executed a massive data extraction protocol. The Trojan horse had completely bypassed their personal firewalls and downloaded every single piece of their illicit financial histories, including Malik's hidden gambling debts and Spencer's illegal offshore kickbacks, leaving them absolutely ruined and entirely trapped. Sylvia smiled as the screen illuminated, displaying folders containing years of wire fraud evidence. The trap had finally snapped shut, closing tight around their throats. There was nowhere left to run. Their ultimate downfall had just been firmly cemented by their very own unchecked and entirely boundless greed. The screen of Sylvia's laptop glowed brightly in the dim hotel suite, casting a harsh, unforgiving blue light over the terrified faces of the three people standing before her. Malik stared blankly at the cascading digital files detailing his massive hidden gambling debts and offshore accounts, his jaw hanging slack in absolute disbelief, while Spencer hyperventilated beside him, his expensive pastel polo shirt suddenly soaked in a cold, nervous sweat. The horrifying realization that their grand, corporate heist had been nothing more than a meticulously constructed trap finally shattered their arrogant delusions. They had confidently walked into this luxurious midtown penthouse suite, expecting a $3 million payday, a golden ticket that would magically erase their massive environmental federal fines and secret financial liabilities. But instead, they were staring directly at their own inescapable destruction, broadcasted live on a high-definition monitor. Spencer let out a guttural, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated rage, his face twisting into a violent mask of cornered desperation, completely refusing to accept that a quiet black woman he deemed inferior had completely outmaneuvered his aggressive business acumen. He lunged forward wildly across the modern glass coffee table, his large, heavy hands reaching out to grab Sylvia by the throat, intending to physically overpower her and completely destroy the laptop containing his damning financial records. Malik, entirely abandoning any remaining pretense of professional corporate composure, moved right behind him, shouting frantically that they could not let her leave this room alive. They genuinely thought they could use brute physical force to silence my senior law partner, relying on the exact same toxic physical intimidation they had always used to carelessly bully their way through life, completely failing to realize that every single aggressive movement they made was being actively monitored and recorded in perfect high-definition video. Sylvia did not even flinch. She simply leaned back in her heavy leather executive chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her expression radiating total absolute indifference as Spencer's fingertips came within mere inches of her pristine collar. The heavy double wooden doors adjoining the next hotel suite suddenly exploded inward with a deafening mechanical crash, the splintered mahogany flying violently across the expensive hotel carpet. A highly trained tactical team of 12 heavily armed federal agents poured instantly into the room, their heavy combat boots thudding aggressively against the floor, carrying assault rifles and shouting absolute commands to freeze and drop to the ground. Immediately, the bright red laser sights of their tactical weapons painted Spencer and Malik's chests, instantly stopping their violent assault, dead in its tracks, freezing them in a moment of pure, unparalleled terror. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the lead agent, roared, his booming voice echoing loudly off the floor to ceiling windows, intermingling with the distant muffled sounds of downtown Atlanta traffic far below. He grabbed Spencer firmly by the back of his collar, forcefully driving him face first into the plush carpet, while two other heavily armored agents tackled Malik, pinning his arms painfully behind his back and placing cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, securing them with a loud, definitive click. Jocelyn let out a piercing, theatrical scream, pressing herself flat against the far decorative wallpaper, sliding down slowly until she hit the floor, trembling uncontrollably as the armed agents swiftly secured the perimeter of the room, checking every single corner for secondary threats. I stepped slowly through the shattered adjoining doorway, leaving the total darkness of the surveillance suite. Behind me, the chaotic shouting of the federal agents died down slightly as I walked purposefully into the center of the penthouse suite, my low heels making a soft, deliberate sound against the thick carpet. Malik looked up from the floor, his cheek pressed uncomfortably against the ground, his eyes widening in pure absolute horror as he saw me standing there looking completely untouched by their pathetic attempts to ruin my life. Spencer struggled violently against the thick, heavy zip ties binding his wrists, screaming at the top of his lungs that this was illegal entrapment, demanding his phone to call his high-priced corporate attorneys, and promising to sue every single person standing in the room. I walked calmly over to the decorative floral arrangement sitting on the marble mantelpiece, running my fingers over the artificial silk petals. I reached in deep and pulled a tiny wireless surveillance camera from between the fake orchids, holding it up high for them to clearly see, before tossing it onto the glass table right next to their fake encrypted hard drive. I looked down at the two pathetic men who had spent their entire adult lives aggressively underestimating my intelligence and calmly informed them that entrapment legally implies they were coerced into committing a crime. I happily reminded them they had actively sought out a rival corporate buyer, eagerly volunteered to sell my highly classified client data, and violently attempted to physically assault a senior law partner, all while being broadcast live directly to the federal agents waiting patiently in the exact next room. The lead agent stepped forward, hauling Spencer roughly to his feet, reciting their Miranda rights in a steady, practiced, monotonous voice, cutting straight through their endless stream of pathetic, desperate excuses. He officially informed them they were being placed under immediate arrest for multiple severe federal charges, detailing the specific criminal counts of felony, corporate espionage, aggressive criminal extortion, and interstate wire fraud. He stated clearly that the irrefutable evidence retrieved from the Trojan horse virus, combined directly with the physical surveillance footage, carried a combined maximum sentence of over 30 years in a federal penitentiary, making it mathematically impossible for either of them to ever see the outside of a prison cell again, while they still had breath in their lungs. Jocelyn watched her husband and my ex-husband being hauled roughly toward the hallway like common street criminals, their faces completely drained of all their unearned, arrogant pride. Her carefully constructed world of extreme luxury and stolen social status had completely dissolved into nothingness. In the span of 5 short minutes, she scrambled frantically across the floor on her hands and knees, her expensive designer silk dress tearing loudly against the shattered wood splinters, sobbing hysterically as she reached out to aggressively grab the hem of my black pencil skirt. "Jasmine, please!" she sobbed loudly, looking up at me with thick, expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly rivers. She begged me repeatedly to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding, pleading desperately for my mercy, claiming she had absolutely no idea what the men were actually planning, and that she was just my innocent, loving sister who desperately needed my immediate help to stay out of a federal prison cell. I looked down coldly at the pathetic woman who had happily mocked my career, stolen my peace, and gleefully plotted my total financial downfall just 20 minutes prior. I reached out slowly, gently fixing her wrinkled collar, smoothing the expensive fabric with methodical, chilling precision. I leaned in close to her ear, feeling her tremble violently with pure, absolute desperation. "I am just protecting my generational wealth," I whispered, my voice perfectly, even and entirely devoid of any mercy like Spencer taught me. The harsh buzzing of my secure cell phone broke the absolute silence of my home office. I stared at the glowing screen, watching my mother's name flash repeatedly. She had never once called this private number before, which meant she had harassed Sylvia or one of my junior associates to get it. I let it ring 5 times before finally swiping to answer. Her voice was frantic, breathless, and completely stripped of the refined Buckhead Country Club accent she had spent decades perfecting. She demanded that I immediately wire $2 million to a federal bail bondsman downtown, claiming Malik and Spencer were being held in maximum security, holding cells. She was hyperventilating, shouting that the conditions were horrific and that they were being treated like common street thugs. I sat back in my leather chair, listening to her panic with complete emotional detachment. I calmly reminded her that corporate espionage and wire fraud were serious federal offenses and that neither of those men were my responsibility anymore. Vivian suddenly shifted her tactics, her tone dropping into a low, desperate plea. Pulling out the absolute last card she had left to play, she began crying, telling me that the criminal justice system was rigged against black men and that it was my fundamental duty as a black woman to protect our family from being destroyed by institutional racism. I listened to her audacity, genuinely marveling at how easily she could weaponize systemic oppression to excuse pure, unadulterated greed. I asked her where this profound sense of racial solidarity was when she was helping my black husband hide his affair with a white mistress, or when Spencer was throwing racial microaggressions at me in my own foyer. I told her that Malik and Spencer were not victims of a rigged system. They were victims of their own boundless arrogance. I ended the call and blocked the number permanently. Less than an hour later, my tablet began to ping relentlessly with notifications from my firm, public relations team. My mother had gone rogue, deciding that if she could not guilt me into compliance, she would destroy my reputation in the court of public opinion. I clicked on the link my lead publicist had sent, bringing up a live video broadcast that was already trending across multiple social media platforms. Vivian was sitting in the back of a taxi, her makeup intentionally smudged to look like a grieving matriarch, her voice shaking as she stared directly into the camera. She told thousands of viewers a completely fabricated story, painting herself as a destitute widow being terrorized by a bitter, jealous daughter. She claimed I was a deeply unstable woman who was punishing her entire family simply because I was unable to keep my own husband happy. She wept theatrically, telling the internet that I had framed my brother-in-law and ex-husband, sending innocent family men to a federal prison out of pure spite. The comments rolled in by the thousands, strangers calling me a monster, a villain, a disgrace to women everywhere, judging me entirely on the tears of a woman who had orchestrated my absolute ruin. The PR team sent frantic messages advising me to immediately release a counterstatement with the hotel surveillance footage to clear my name and stop the viral smear campaign. I completely ignored their panicked advice, refusing to entertain my mother's public circus. Engaging with her online would only feed the exact chaotic energy she was desperate to create. Instead, I turned off my tablet and opened the heavy iron safe hidden behind the bookshelf in my office. I reached inside and pulled out a thick sealed envelope bearing the signature of Elias, my late father. It was a document I had kept completely hidden for 3 entire years, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to introduce it into the atmosphere. I drafted a formal legal summons on my custom corporate letterhead, commanding the immediate presence of Vivian, Jocelyn, Spencer, and Malik for the final unsealing and reading of my father's true, authentic last will and testament. I hired an elite team of private process servers, instructing them to track down my mother and deliver the heavily sealed summons directly into her hands. No matter where she was hiding in the city, I knew exactly how their greedy minds worked. The moment they saw the words, "true will," they would immediately assume my father had hidden a massive offshore cash reserve, a secret untraceable fortune designed to bypass creditors and save them from total ruin. 2 days later, the heavy mahogany doors of Sylvia's downtown law firm swung open. My family had clearly managed to secure high-interest predatory bail loans to temporarily escape their federal holding cells because Malik and Spencer walked into the grand conference room wearing wrinkled suits and deeply bruised egos. Jocelyn marched in right beside them, clutching my mother's arm. Both women wearing oversized dark sunglasses to hide their exhausted, swollen eyes despite facing decades in federal prison and losing everything they owned. They still carried that lingering stench of unearned arrogance. They sat down across the expansive glass table, glaring at me with open, visceral hatred. Spencer adjusted his collar, leaning forward with a greedy, desperate glimmer. Returning to his eyes, he smugly announced that they had endured my pathetic little revenge stunts, but that they were now ready to claim the hidden trust fund Elias had obviously left behind to bail them out of this temporary inconvenience. Spencer sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, demanding that Sylvia tear open the envelope immediately so they could collect their millions and leave. He bragged that my father always favored Jocelyn, and that whatever millions were inside would easily cover their legal fees and completely silence the federal prosecutors. Malik nodded eagerly beside him, rubbing his hands together, imagining a massive financial payout that would magically erase the federal indictments looming over his head. They stared at the thick, sealed envelope resting on the center of the glass table, completely convinced that their ultimate salvation was hiding right inside those pages, waiting to restore them to their former elite glory. They had absolutely no idea that the true will was not going to save them. It was the final, absolutely lethal nail in the coffin of their miserable existence. The heavy oak doors of the grand boardroom closed, shutting out the ambient noise of the law firm. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long glass table, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Directly across from me sat the people who had dedicated their entire miserable existence to my destruction. My mother. Vivian wore a dark conservative suit clutching a tissue. She did not need playing the role of the tragic matriarch to perfection. Jocelyn sat next to her, practically bouncing in her expensive leather chair, her eyes darting greedily around the room, desperate for salvation. Spencer leaned back with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face, completely ignoring the fact that he was currently out on a predatory bail loan, facing decades in federal prison. Malik sat at the very edge of the group, his hands trembling slightly as he repeatedly checked his secure phone. He looked exhausted and defeated, but still clinging to the desperate, pathetic hope of a massive, unearned payout that would magically solve all his self-inflicted disasters. He kept glancing at me with a mixture of resentment and desperation, clearly hoping this meeting would end with my absolute financial ruin, so he could feel justified in his massive infidelities. Sylvia stood at the head of the table, adjusting her reading glasses. The room fell into absolute silence as she broke the heavy red wax seal on the thick manila envelope bearing my late father's crest. She pulled out the crisp parchment documents, setting them flat against the glass surface with methodical precision. She announced in a clear, authoritative tone that we were gathered for the final reading of the true last will and testament of Elias, my father. Spencer rubbed his hands together, letting out a low, hungry chuckle, telling Jocelyn that their absolute nightmare was finally over and they were about to be fully restored to their rightful place at the absolute top of the Atlanta social hierarchy, escaping the federal indictments through a miracle of inheritance. Sylvia began to read the formal legal jargon, her voice echoing loudly in the sterile boardroom. She detailed the distribution of my father's minor personal effects, a vintage watch collection left to a distant cousin, some antique furniture bequeathed to my mother. Vivian let out a dramatic sigh of disappointment, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, clearly expecting a massive offshore cash account to be announced immediately. Then, Sylvia turned to the primary asset, the massive corporate holding company that contained the physical real estate firm my father had built from the ground up. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm as I watched the pure, unadulterated greed wash over my sister's face, anticipating her golden ticket. Sylvia looked up from the document, her eyes scanning the room before stating clearly that Elias left the entire physical real estate company, including its highly respected corporate name, and all associated brand trademarks, entirely and exclusively to his eldest daughter Jocelyn and her husband Spencer. The boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of triumphant cheers. Jocelyn jumped up from her chair, throwing her arms around Spencer's neck, screaming at the top of her lungs that they were saved. Mother clasped her hands together in dramatic prayer, thanking God that the universe had finally delivered justice to the right child. Malik leaned forward, his eyes wide, demanding to know exactly how much the corporate brand name was worth on the open market, eager to claim his slice of the pie. Jocelyn, pacing the length of the boardroom, began plotting their immediate financial resurrection with boundless arrogant energy, the reality of her pending federal prison sentence completely vanishing from her mind. She bragged loudly that the corporate name alone carried decades of elite industry goodwill, boasting they could immediately liquidate the company brand, selling the prestigious naming rights to a massive offshore developer. She calculated aloud that they could easily secure $40 million in a blind auction, instantly paying off their monumental federal environmental fines, erasing Malik's hidden gambling debts, and leaving them with more than enough capital to buy an entirely new luxury estate in an exclusive gated community. She looked at me with pure, venomous triumph, her eyes wide with manic joy, telling me that the golden child always wins in the end, because Dad knew she was the only one truly capable of carrying his powerful legacy. My mother chimed in, nodding vigorously, wiping away tears of absolute joy, ruining her expensive makeup in the process. She looked at me with a sickening look of pity, telling me I should learn a hard lesson in humility today. Vivian proudly declared that Elias always knew Jocelyn was the true star of the family, and that my obsessive need to work hard and study financial spreadsheets was just a sad, pathetic compensation for my lack of natural brilliance. She told me I should be incredibly grateful. They were even allowing me to sit in the same room while they collected their millions, promising that Jocelyn might throw a few $1,000s my way to help me cover my basic living expenses since my career was clearly over. Spencer slammed his hands flat against the glass table, leaning aggressively in my direction, his bruising ego suddenly inflating to massive proportions, completely forgetting that he was wearing a hidden federal ankle monitor beneath his designer trousers. He flashed a cruel southern smile, his eyes filled with toxic racial microaggressions and unchecked privilege. He sneered at me, mocking my silent composure, asking if I needed a moment to cry over my absolute failure as a daughter and a professional. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice dripping with absolute condescension, and said, "Your dad finally realized who had the brains in this family. You get nothing." He laughed, a loud, booming sound that bounced off the boardroom walls, claiming that being an arrogant little tax girl meant absolutely nothing when it came to real raw corporate inheritance and undeniable blood rights. I did not flinch, I did not blink. I simply sat there watching them celebrate a hollow victory built on an absolute illusion. I let them drink the intoxicating poison of their unearned triumph, allowing their fragile egos to expand to the point of bursting. I knew exactly what my father had done, and I knew exactly what was coming next. Their desperate joy was the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. They were throwing a massive victory parade on the deck of a sinking ship, totally blind to the massive iceberg rapidly tearing through the hull beneath their feet. I remained completely silent, waiting for the ultimate trap to snap shut around their greedy throats. Sylvia waited patiently for their chaotic celebration to naturally die down. She did not rush them. She simply stood there, watching the arrogant display with cold professional detachment. When Jocelyn finally sat back down, exhausted by her own greed, expecting Sylvia to hand over the corporate transfer documents, the room fell quiet once again. Sylvia slowly reached into the thick manila envelope, pulling out a second, much smaller stack of documents printed on heavy blue security paper. She tapped the pages against the glass table, adjusting her glasses one final time. The smug, victorious smiles on their faces began to slowly falter as they noticed the severe shift in Sylvia's demeanor. She looked directly at Spencer and Jocelyn, her voice dropping an octave, replacing her previous neutral tone with something sharp and undeniably lethal. She cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence, telling them that while they did inherit the physical real estate company and the brand name, there was a secondary document that completely superseded all primary distributions. She paused, letting the absolute terror begin to dawn in their greedy eyes, before stating clearly, however, there is a secondary document, the irrevocable trust. Sylvia held up the heavy blue security paper, letting the crisp rustle of the document echo loudly across the silent boardroom. She looked directly at the smug expressions still plastered across Jocelyn and Spencer's faces and completely shattered their reality. She explained with absolute legal precision that exactly 4 years ago, my father Elias had come to me in total secret. He knew his health was rapidly failing, and he knew exactly how greedy and incredibly destructive his wife and eldest daughter truly were. So we executed a brilliant and entirely lawful corporate maneuver. We quietly separated every single valuable asset from the toxic liabilities of the primary real estate holding company, working long nights behind closed doors to completely restructure the entire foundation of the family empire. Sylvia flipped to the second page, outlining the monumental transfer of wealth. She detailed how my father had methodically moved all the liquid cash, the completely clean commercial properties, the massive blue-chip stock portfolios, and a liquid cash reserve of exactly $50 million out of the family business entirely. He transferred every single penny of that absolute fortune into a highly secure South Dakota generation, skipping irrevocable trust, a financial fortress specifically designed to be utterly impenetrable to outside creditors, federal agencies, and greedy family members looking for an unearned payday. Spencer suddenly stopped smiling, his jaw dropping slightly as the complicated legal terminology began to slowly register in his frantic mind. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a sickening realization. Malik sat completely paralyzed in his chair, the blood draining entirely from his face, realizing the massive cash payout he was desperately banking on to hide from his divorce courts had just vanished into thin air. Jocelyn let out a nervous little laugh, demanding to know what Sylvia was talking about, insisting that she was just named the sole owner of the legacy real estate company and the prestigious brand name, entirely refusing to accept that she had been completely outplayed. Sylvia placed the documents flat on the glass table and looked Jocelyn dead in the eyes, delivering the ultimate lethal blow. She informed my sister that the physical company she had just so proudly inherited was nothing more than a hollowed-out radioactive shell. My father had intentionally left the original corporate entity entirely empty, except for the crushing underwater commercial mortgages, the massive failing industrial park properties, and the monumental $12 million federal Environmental Protection Agency fines that Spencer had so arrogantly triggered when he aggressively mismanaged the toxic waste cleanup. My father had effectively handed them a ticking financial time bomb wrapped in a shiny corporate bow, leaving them completely legally responsible for millions of dollars in corporate debt and federal penalties, with absolutely zero assets left inside the company to pay them off. The realization hit them like a massive freight train. Jocelyn began to hyperventilate, her hands clutching the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She looked at Spencer, screaming at him to do something, to call his own high-priced lawyers, to stop this from happening, to find a loophole in the paperwork. But Spencer was completely frozen, staring at the blue security paper in total absolute horror. He was already drowning in personal federal indictments for corporate espionage and interstate wire fraud, wearing a hidden federal ankle monitor beneath his designer trousers. And now he had just legally inherited millions of dollars in inescapable toxic corporate debt from his dead father-in-law, a man he had constantly mocked and aggressively underestimated, leaving him facing total financial annihilation. Vivian let out a loud theatrical sob, pressing her hands to her chest, demanding to know what was left for her, claiming she was the grieving widow who had stood by Elias for decades and deserved the massive $50 million cash reserve to maintain her high society lifestyle. She looked at Sylvia pleadingly, asking who controlled the South Dakota trust account, expecting the law firm to step in and distribute the funds to the rightful matriarch, so she could quickly pay off the predatory bail loans she had secured to keep her son-in-law out of a maximum security holding cell. Sylvia did not even blink. She simply turned the page and formally announced that my father had legally appointed me, Jasmine, as the absolute sole trustee and the one and only exclusive beneficiary of the $50 million generation, skipping irrevocable trust. There was no oversight committee. There were no shared dividends. There was absolutely nothing left for anyone else in the room. I sat at the far end of the long glass table, perfectly still, watching their entire universe violently collapse into ash. They had spent decades treating me like an insignificant scapegoat, mocking my career, isolating me from family events, and aggressively plotting my total destruction, while I had been sitting quietly on the ultimate throne, holding the absolute keys to the entire generational kingdom. Jocelyn lunged forward across the table, her designer sunglasses clattering to the floor, screaming that it was entirely illegal, claiming I had violently manipulated a sick, dying man into signing away her rightful inheritance. She threatened to tie the estate up in probate court for the next 30 years, swearing she would destroy me and prove that the blue security paper was a massive fraudulent conspiracy. Malik tried to grab her arm to pull her back down, to stop her from embarrassing herself further, but she violently shook him off. Her face, twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unhinged desperation, demanding that I hand over her money immediately. Sylvia raised her hand, demanding absolute silence, her voice cutting through the chaotic screaming like a sharp razor blade. She informed them that challenging an irrevocable trust of this specific magnitude in the state of South Dakota was a legal impossibility, especially since it had been quietly established and fully funded years before my father's actual physical decline. She told them they had absolutely zero legal standing to contest a single signature. She then reached into the very bottom of the thick manila envelope and pulled out a single heavily sealed handwritten letter. She told the room that Elias had fully anticipated this exact, violent, ungrateful reaction and had left one final, deeply personal statement to be read aloud, precisely at this exact moment. The boardroom fell completely silent, the only sound being the frantic, ragged breathing of the people who had just lost everything. Sylvia cleared her throat and began reading my father's familiar words, his booming voice echoing through the sterile boardroom from beyond the grave. The letter started with a chillingly calm tone. Elias wrote that he had spent his entire life building a massive corporate empire from the dirt up, only to watch his greedy, entitled wife Vivian treat his monumental success like an endless personal ATM machine, bleeding his accounts dry for useless country club memberships and hollow social status. He wrote that she was a vain, empty woman who cared more about appearances than she ever cared about her own husband. Then the letter shifted, focusing entirely on Jocelyn and Spencer. My father wrote that he had watched his eldest daughter grow into a completely useless and aggressively vain woman who cared more about designer labels and cocktail parties than the actual hard work required to sustain a family legacy. He explicitly wrote that he had seen right through Spencer's fake, charismatic Southern gentleman charm. From the very first day Jocelyn brought him home, he explicitly called Spencer a pathetic racist parasite, a fragile, deeply incompetent man who desperately needed to constantly belittle a brilliant black woman, just to feel a fleeting sense of unearned superiority. My father wrote that leaving the toxic shell company to Spencer and Jocelyn was his ultimate final revenge. A carefully designed trap meant to completely bury them under the exact same massive debt and legal destruction they had so arrogantly brought upon themselves. He stated clearly that they deserved absolutely nothing but their own miserable failure, and that he was leaving them to completely rot in the exact hell they had so eagerly created for everyone else. Malik stood there, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to calculate a way out of the absolute financial slaughterhouse my father had built from beyond the grave. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger across the expansive glass boardroom table, a desperate manic gleam flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He loudly proclaimed that because our divorce had not been officially finalized by the Atlanta family court judge, he was still legally recognized as my husband and therefore entirely entitled to exactly 50% of the $50 million generation skipping irrevocable trust. He began spouting absolute nonsense about marital assets and community property laws, completely convinced that his refusal to sign the divorce papers months ago had somehow miraculously transformed him into a multimillionaire. He leaned his heavy palms against the glass surface, grinning with a sickeningly triumphant smirk, thinking he had found the ultimate legal loophole that would instantly pay off his massive hidden gambling debts and fund his new life with his pregnant mistress. Sylvia did not even blink. She simply adjusted her reading glasses with chilling professional precision and let out a single sharp laugh that instantly shattered Malik's arrogant delusion. She slowly reached into the bottom of the thick manila envelope and retrieved a single piece of heavy bonded paper, sliding it gracefully across the smooth glass directly into Malik's line of sight. She calmly informed him that South Dakota trust laws completely and entirely insulate assets from divorce proceedings, regardless of marital status. But beyond that undeniable legal fact, she happily pointed to the ironclad prenuptial agreement resting beneath his trembling hands, the very same document he had eagerly and desperately signed 10 entire years ago when my father intentionally leaked fake financial documents suggesting the family empire was drowning in millions of dollars of IRS debt. Elias and I had specifically engineered that exact illusion to test Malik's loyalty before the wedding, and the cowardly man had practically broken his wrist, signing away all future rights to any family inheritance just to protect himself from absorbing our imaginary financial ruin. The color rapidly drained from Malik's face as he stared down at his own signature, the horrific realization washing over him that my father had actively known he was a gold-digging parasite from the very first day he stepped foot into our family home. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed into the heavy leather executive chair, his mind completely unable to process the fact that his own selfish cowardice a decade ago had legally locked him out of a $50 million fortune. Spencer, who was still pacing frantically near the mahogany doors, his face a violent shade of purple, following his horrific racist outburst, suddenly turned his unchecked aggressive hatred entirely toward Malik, the fragile facade of their criminal alliance instantly dissolving into toxic mutual destruction. Spencer screamed that Malik was a pathetic, cheating loser who had dragged him into the federal wire fraud sting operation, blaming my ex-husband for their impending prison sentences despite the fact that Spencer himself was the one who initiated the corporate espionage plot. The two men who just 48 hours prior had smugly conspired to completely dismantle my career and steal my corporate data were now lunging wildly at each other across the expensive boardroom furniture. Spencer grabbed Malik by the lapels of his wrinkled suit, violently throwing him against the decorative wood paneling, while Malik fought back with clumsy, desperate punches. Their unhinged brawl was the ultimate pathetic display of their absolute incompetence, tearing each other to pieces while wearing hidden federal ankle monitors, perfectly validating every single terrible thing my father had ever written about them in his final letter. My mother, Vivian, watching the two men physically destroy each other in the corner of the room, suddenly realized with crystal clarity that she was hopelessly shackled to a rapidly sinking ship that contained absolutely zero lifeboats. She took one look at her golden child, Jocelyn, who was still curled in a pathetic ball on the floor, hyperventilating over the realization that she was now the proud legal owner of $12 million in toxic environmental debt and made a split-second decision to completely abandon her favorite daughter. Vivian dropped to her knees, crawling across the pristine carpet, completely ruining her expensive designer stockings. She reached out to aggressively grab my ankles, her tear-streaked face twisting into a pathetic mask of manufactured maternal desperation. She sobbed hysterically, begging me to forgive her, claiming she had always known I was the brilliant child, and insisting that Elias had forced her to favor Jocelyn. To protect my genius from public scrutiny, she swore she would gladly cut all ties with the rest of the family if I would just allocate a tiny fraction of the trust to maintain her luxury buckhead lifestyle. I slowly pulled my legs back, sliding my leather chair away from her grasping manicured hands, treating her desperate touch like a toxic contagion. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life violently minimizing my existence and calmly reminded her that my father's letter explicitly detailed her decades of hidden country club affairs and absolute moral bankruptcy. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my secure corporate phone. Tapping the screen with methodical precision, I informed Vivian that I had already instructed my public relations team to permanently unseal my father's letter and distribute the undeniable proof of her infidelity and extreme greed directly to the private email inbox of every single wealthy socialite charity chairwoman and elite country club board member in the entire state of Georgia. I watched the sheer absolute horror paralyze her facial features as she realized her carefully curated high society reputation, her only true currency in this world, had just been instantly and permanently vaporized into ash. Before Vivian could even muster a scream, the heavy boardroom doors swung open forcefully, revealing the elite private security team I had specifically hired for this exact moment. They were closely followed by the downtown federal bail bondsmen, who took one look at Spencer and Malik brawling against the wall and angrily announced that their violent physical altercation actively violated the strict behavioral terms of their predatory bail agreements. The heavily armed security guards moved in, immediately hauling the two pathetic men away by their collars, dragging them kicking and screaming horrific threats back toward the elevators, destined straight for the maximum security downtown holding cells. Vivian and Jocelyn, completely stripped of their corporate titles, their stolen wealth, and their unearned dignity, were aggressively escorted out right behind them, their hysterical sobbing echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy doors finally clicked shut. I remained seated perfectly still at the head of the long glass table, the absolute silence of the room washing over me like a cleansing wave. Sylvia quietly gathered the legal documents, slipping them back into the manila envelope before giving me a single respectful nod of pure professional admiration. She handed me the heavy metal keys to the corporate estate and silently exited the room, leaving me completely alone in the massive boardroom. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my skirt, and walked over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The people who had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable scapegoat were now completely buried beneath the rubble of their own toxic greed. I had finally successfully eradicated the parasites from my bloodline, completely securing the massive generational empire my father and I had quietly built in the shadows. And as the afternoon sun caught the reflection of the glass, I realized my sweet revenge was finally entirely complete. My serene moment of absolute victory, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, was shattered early the very next morning when my secure corporate phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sylvia, demanding my immediate presence back at her downtown law firm. I walked into the secondary glass-enclosed mediation room, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, only to find Malik sitting aggressively across the heavy mahogany table. He had clearly managed to scrape together just enough borrowed cash from predatory high-interest lenders to post his secondary federal bail because he was glaring at me with a renewed, sickening sense of unearned confidence. Sitting directly beside him was a slick, high-priced, aggressive divorce attorney wearing a custom-tailored suit that reeked of cheap cologne and desperate ambition. The attorney slammed a massive, thick stack of hastily prepared legal filings onto the pristine glass table, demanding an immediate emergency injunction to completely freeze the $50 million South Dakota generation skipping irrevocable trust. The slick lawyer arrogantly cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie before announcing that since the final absolute divorce decree had not yet been officially stamped and finalized by the Atlanta family court judge, the marital assets were still legally considered communal property. He smugly argued that the ironclad prenuptial agreement Malik had signed a decade ago only covered the physical real estate holding company, and that any newly discovered liquid cash reserves automatically reverted to a standard 50-50 split under state community property laws. Malik leaned back in his expensive leather executive chair, crossing his arms over his chest, with that familiar, toxic, confident smirk, returning to his bruised and exhausted face, completely ignoring the heavy federal ankle monitor securely strapped to his leg. He actually had the audacity to flash me a cruel, mocking wink, bragging loudly that he was going to take his rightful $25 million share and permanently move to a private tropical island, leaving me behind to rot in the toxic corporate debt and federal environmental fines my father had intentionally left behind. He laughed that deep, booming, arrogant laugh, telling me I was a pathetic fool for thinking I could outsmart him, claiming he deserved every single penny of that trust fund, as compensation for having to endure a miserable, loveless marriage to a cold, obsessed corporate workaholic. Sylvia did not even flinch. She did not blink or show a single ounce of concern at his pathetic theatrical display. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee, setting the ceramic mug down with a soft, precise click before calmly opening her heavy leather briefcase. She did not pull out the blue security paper of the irrevocable trust, and she did not pull out the decade-old prenuptial agreement. Instead, she pulled out the exact same fast-tracked divorce documents Malik had so violently and aggressively demanded I sign just a few short months ago. The very same thick stack of papers he had forcefully shoved across my kitchen island when he was blindingly desperate to abandon our marriage and secure his immediate future with his young, pregnant mistress. Sylvia slid the crisp white documents across the smooth glass table, tapping her perfectly manicured finger against a specific highly binding legal clause buried deep in the fine print at the very bottom of the fourth page. She looked directly at Malik's arrogant, high-priced lawyer and explained with razor-sharp, lethal precision that when Malik aggressively rushed the divorce proceedings to secure what he foolishly and greedily believed was a guaranteed $2.25 million cash settlement, he had impatiently signed a complete and total permanent waiver of financial discovery. She read the clause aloud, her voice echoing off the glass walls, detailing how he had been so blindingly greedy, so incredibly desperate to finalize his massive payout and run away to start his new life that he had legally and permanently waived his right to investigate, audit, or claim any future undisclosed accounts, hidden offshore trusts, or unlisted financial assets belonging to my personal estate. Sylvia smiled a cold, terrifying smile, reminding Malik of the exact moment he had wildly scribbled his signature on that page, explicitly refusing to read the fine print because he arrogantly believed he was the smartest man in the room, informing them both that by aggressively refusing to do his basic legal due diligence out of sheer impatience, Malik had voluntarily and legally locked himself out of the $50 million fortune, forever cementing his own total destruction. The color rapidly drained from the slick lawyer's face, turning a sickly shade of gray as he rapidly scanned the undeniable legal signatures resting on the glass table, recognizing his own client's horrific, fatal mistake, realizing Malik had completely and utterly doomed his own case by intentionally lying about the state of their divorce paperwork. The attorney slowly closed his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut, and pushed his chair back, looking at Malik with absolute visceral disgust. He coldly informed my ex-husband that there was absolutely nothing any lawyer on earth could do to break a voluntary signed waiver of discovery, especially one executed with independent legal counsel. Present the monumental, crushing reality of his own sheer stupidity finally crashed down on Malik's broad shoulders like a suffocating physical weight. He began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as the lawyer simply stood up and walked out of the room, abandoning him, he was not walking away with $25 million. He was walking away with his original legally binding divorce settlement, which explicitly meant he was entirely and solely responsible for his own massive hidden sports gambling debts, offshore crypto losses, and the crushing $4.5 million in predatory personal liabilities he had secretly accumulated behind my back. During our entire marriage, he had played himself with absolute poetic perfection, leaving the marriage with absolutely nothing but total financial ruin and a pending federal prison sentence. Before Malik could even process the horrific, undeniable fact that he was now officially destitute, completely alone, and facing decades behind bars. A sudden, chaotic, violent commotion erupted in the law firm reception area, echoing loudly down the quiet marble hallway. The heavy glass doors of the mediation room suddenly burst open, and his young pregnant mistress stormed into the room, completely bypassing the panicked security guards who were desperately trying to hold her back. She was shaking with pure, unadulterated rage, her dark mascara running in thick, ugly streaks down her flushed cheeks, having clearly just seen the viral morning news reports detailing his impending federal wire fraud indictments, his massive hidden gambling debts, and his absolute total lack of hidden generational wealth. She marched directly up to where Malik sat paralyzed in his chair, her face twisted into a mask of furious betrayal. She screamed at the top of her lungs, calling him a broke, pathetic, manipulative liar, shrieking that hostile federal agents had just violently raided her apartment, looking for his stolen corporate laptops, and seized her frozen bank accounts. She sobbed hysterically, realizing she had destroyed her own life for a man who was entirely bankrupt. She violently pulled the massive, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger, realizing it was likely bought with stolen, fraudulent funds, and hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at his bruised face, leaving him completely shattered, in the wreckage of his own making. The sweet satisfaction of watching the sprawling Atlanta skyline from the law firm windows was only the quiet prelude to the absolute digital slaughter that was about to unfold over the next 48 hours, while I was efficiently securing the massive transfer of the $50 million irrevocable trust into my private, heavily guarded accounts. My mother, Vivian, had desperately retreated to the only battlefield she actually understood: social media, attempting to frantically spin a pathetic, public narrative. She had posted a series of heavily filtered, carefully staged photos, claiming she was gracefully stepping away from the toxic corporate real estate world to focus on family unity, pretending that the violent implosion at the law firm was simply a mutual restructuring agreement. She desperately wanted the elite Buckhead society to believe she was still the untouchable, wealthy matriarch, gracefully weathering a minor transitional storm. But her fragile, transparent illusion was violently ripped apart when Malik's young pregnant mistress decided she had absolutely nothing left to lose. The mistress went completely rogue, launching a live video broadcast on Instagram that immediately went undeniably viral across every single local Atlanta gossip network and elite social circle, sitting in the front seat of her cheap compact car, mascara running in thick dark streaks down her flushed cheeks. She held up her phone to the camera and pressed play, revealing to the world that she had been recording audio through the thin cracks of the law firm mediation room doors before she burst in. The broadcast played crystal clear, unedited audio of the entire horrific aftermath. The digital audience of thousands heard the exact pathetic moment Malik admitted to his crippling $4.5 million debt. But the true devastating blow landed when the recording played, Spencer's unhinged tirade completely exposing his fake polished liberal savior persona, as he screamed horrific racial slurs and toxic garbage at Malik, his genuine unfiltered hatred echoing through the phones of thousands of shocked viewers, instantly obliterating his carefully crafted public image. But the mistress was not finished destroying their lives. She turned the camera back to her tear-stained face and dropped the ultimate nuclear bomb directly onto my mother's carefully curated reputation. She revealed with explicit, undeniable details that Vivian had actively known about Malik's affair for an entire year. The mistress explained to the thousands of rapidly commenting live viewers that Vivian had secretly met with her at a discreet downtown coffee shop, aggressively demanding she remain completely hidden until my fake divorce settlement was finalized. The mistress exposed that Vivian had actively protected the cheating husband of her own daughter, purely out of extreme greed, hoping to secure her own massive cut of the imaginary corporate payout. She painted Vivian not as a tragic grieving widow or a supportive mother, but as a cold, calculated conspirator who would eagerly sell her own daughter's dignity and sanity for a slightly larger slice of corporate inheritance. The social fallout was absolute, immediate, and entirely merciless within hours of the live stream ending. Vivian's entire prestigious universe violently collapsed around her. The elite country club board of directors convened an emergency digital vote and officially permanently revoked her legacy membership, citing the severe moral turpitude clause in their bylaws. Her secure corporate phone began ringing endlessly, not with sympathetic friends offering support, but with sharp, disgusted rejections. The chairwoman of her exclusive charity committees aggressively demanded her immediate resignation, completely erasing her name from the upcoming gala planning boards and demanding she return all organizational materials. Even her prestigious church circle, the one place she believed she held untouchable moral authority, sent a formal unified email informing her she was no longer welcome to host the lavish Sunday luncheons she had spent decades meticulously kissing the rings of Atlanta high society. And in less than 3 hours, that exact same society threw her entirely to the wolves, blacklisting her name so thoroughly she would never be able to show her face at a charity luncheon or a country club brunch. Ever again, she was left completely alone, sitting in the hollow shell of her distressed sale mansion, watching her entire social currency turn to worthless dust, realizing that without her stolen wealth and her fake morality, she was absolutely nothing. As the chaotic public humiliation completely consumed their miserable lives, I sat completely undisturbed in the expansive living room of the new luxury penthouse I had immediately purchased with the first authorized liquid distribution from my trust. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city. I now quietly and powerfully controlled my public relations team, had frantically advised me to release a neutral corporate statement, distancing myself from the viral scandal, but I explicitly instructed them to maintain absolute total silence. I knew that any word from me, any response or acknowledgement would only give them a pathetic lifeline to hold on to. Instead, I became a total ghost, letting my profound silence act as an invisible amplifier for their total self-destruction. I sat back on my custom velvet sofa, sipping a glass of rare vintage wine, simply watching the digital feeds explode, letting my enemies brutally tear each other apart, performing the exact labor of my revenge for me, without me ever having to lift a single finger or speak a single word. The silence was intoxicating. It was the ultimate power move, proving that they were completely insignificant to my new reality. The massive $50 million trust had not just given me generational wealth. It had given me the ultimate luxury of total detachment. I watched their desperate scrambling, as if observing pathetic insects trapped in a glass jar. By the time the weekend arrived, the warm, bright Atlanta afternoon had violently shifted into a massive torrential thunderstorm. Heavy, dark gray clouds rolling aggressively over the city, casting everything into deep, shadowy darkness. I was standing by the massive glass window, watching the heavy rain violently wash over the city streets below, feeling completely unburdened and profoundly light. For the first time in 32 years, I was completely untethered from their toxic weight, rich beyond their wildest comprehension and entirely at peace. Then the secure intercom on my pristine kitchen island suddenly buzzed, breaking the absolute silence of my sanctuary. The concierge from the heavily guarded lobby desk sounded deeply uncomfortable as he informed me that there was a desperate woman demanding to see me immediately, aggressively claiming it was a life-or-death family emergency. I slowly walked over to the digital security panel and tapped the glowing screen to view the live lobby camera feed. And my breath hitched slightly. Standing there, completely soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, her expensive designer coat completely ruined by the pouring rain, and her face twisted into a pathetic mask of total absolute ruin, was my mother, Vivian pleading with the security guards, begging for a single moment of my time, looking like a drowned ghost of the woman who had once thought she ruled the world. The glowing screen of the digital security panel illuminated the dark, quiet corners of my pristine, expansive kitchen as I stood there in absolute silence, watching the high-definition feed of the luxury lobby. Below, the torrential afternoon thunderstorm was raging aggressively outside the heavy glass doors, violently thrashing against the expensive marble exterior of my new building. And there, kneeling directly on the freezing wet pavement, completely drenched and entirely stripped of her untouchable high society, arrogance, was my mother Vivian. She was frantically slamming her manicured hands against the reinforced security glass, her mouth opening and closing in pathetic, desperate screams that the camera feed captured in chilling, absolute silence. Her ruined designer coat clung to her shivering, fragile frame like a heavy, wet garbage bag, and her meticulously dyed hair was plastered against her pale face in ugly, tangled streaks. The lobby concierge's voice crackled nervously over the secure intercom, breaking the profound quiet of my penthouse, asking once again if he should call the local downtown authorities to have the trespassing woman forcefully removed from the premises. I stared at the pathetic, trembling figure on the screen, feeling an incredibly strange and profound sense of total, absolute emptiness. Taking a slow, deep, methodical breath, before quietly instructing the concierge to tell the armed security guards to stand down and simply open the front doors, I turned away from the digital panel, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my perfectly tailored silk trousers, and walked slowly toward my private elevator. The descent from the penthouse was completely silent, the smooth mechanical hum of the elevator car, perfectly matching the cold, methodical rhythm of my own heartbeat. I was not angry. I was not sad. I was simply stepping down into the final necessary chapter of the violent generational war. They had started decades ago. The polished silver doors slid open with a soft, pleasant chime, revealing the expansive, brightly lit marble lobby. The elite security personnel immediately stepped back, respectfully, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for me. As I walked deliberately toward the front entrance, the heavy glass doors were pushed open just a fraction, letting the freezing, violent wind and the deafening, aggressive roar of the thunderstorm violently whip through the pristine lobby interior. Vivian practically collapsed through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the polished marble floor, leaving a pathetic, messy trail of dirty rainwater and ruined pride in her wake. She looked up and saw me standing there, perfectly warm and entirely untouchable in my new fortress of absolute generational wealth, and she immediately threw herself forward, crawling on her hands and knees across the cold stone floor, sobbing hysterically. She reached out desperately, trying to grasp the hem of my trousers. But the security guards instantly stepped forward, blocking her pathetic advance. She collapsed back onto her heels, weeping with an unhinged theatrical desperation, screaming over the loud thunder, begging her sweet, beautiful baby girl to please show some tiny ounce of mercy. She choked out a frantic, pathetic monologue, claiming that she had been horribly manipulated by Spencer and Jocelyn, swearing that she had always secretly known I was the brilliant savior of the entire family. She sobbed that her bank accounts had been entirely frozen by aggressive, predatory creditors, that her distress sale mansion had been completely locked down by the federal bank, and that every single one of her elite country club friends had violently turned their backs on her, leaving her completely destitute, with absolutely nowhere to go. She clasped her trembling hands together, begging me to let her move into the spare bedroom of my luxury penthouse, promising to be the perfect, loving, supportive mother she had never been. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent 32 years treating my existence like a toxic inconvenience, watching her leverage the absolute last desperate drops of her manufactured maternal affection just to secure a warm bed and a fresh, limitless line of credit. The heavy silence stretched between us, cutting completely through the chaotic noise of the howling storm outside. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I did not offer her the satisfaction of a passionate, emotional reaction. Instead, I looked dead into her panicked, tear-streaked eyes and spoke with a chilling, absolute calmness that instantly froze the frantic sobbing in her throat. "You didn't come here because you love me, Mom. You came here because the ATM closed. The words hit her like a massive physical blow, instantly shattering the fragile, desperate delusion that she could manipulate her way back into the massive generational fortune. The manufactured tears stopped, completely replaced by a stark, horrifying realization of her own absolute, inescapable doom. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my trousers and pulled out two very specific items that my legal team had meticulously prepared earlier that afternoon. I leaned forward slightly, dropping them onto the wet marble floor directly in front of her trembling knees. The first item was a cheap plastic prepaid keycard for an incredibly low-budget extended stay motel located on the dangerous industrial outskirts of the city, a place where the elite Buckhead society women would never dare to look. The second item was a freshly printed paper job application for the night shift hostess position at a struggling local 24-hour diner. A brutal physical reminder of the exact blue-collar labor she had spent her entire life aggressively mocking. Vivian stared down at the cheap plastic card and the crumpled paper, as if I had just dropped a live explosive grenade at her feet, her mouth opening and closing in absolute stunned, horrified silence. I looked down at her completely ruined form one last time, delivering the final absolute terms of her new, miserable reality. My voice echoing coldly in the massive marble space after 30 days. You are entirely on your own. Build your own legacy. I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for the inevitable screaming, or the violent curses, or the pathetic begging to resume. I simply turned my back on the shivering, ruined woman, kneeling in the puddle of her own miserable, toxic consequences. Heavy glass security doors automatically sealed shut behind me, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the pouring rain and locking her out in the freezing dark storm forever. I walked smoothly back across the pristine marble lobby, not looking back over my shoulder a single time, stepping gracefully into my private elevator, watching the silver doors slide silently shut as I ascended back to my penthouse, entirely free at last. The crisp autumn wind swept through the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta, rattling the golden leaves against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly established corporate headquarters. I stood at the head of a massive reclaimed wood conference table, looking out at a room entirely filled with 30 brilliant driven black women in finance who were presenting their final portfolio analyses for the quarter. My new philanthropic venture. The Elias Foundation was fully funded by the initial distributions from my irrevocable trust and was specifically designed to completely dismantle the toxic old boys club that had tried to bury me for a decade. I walked slowly around the room, nodding in deep appreciation as a brilliant young analyst from Spelman College confidently projected a comprehensive hedge fund restructuring plan onto the digital display. There were no raised voices, no condescending interruptions, and absolutely no unearned arrogance. Poisoning the air, I had built a sanctuary of pure, unadulterated excellence, funding their startup ventures and providing the exact mentorship my father had quietly given to me. The energy in the room was vibrant and fiercely supportive, a complete and total departure from the suffocating toxicity I had endured for 32 years. Seeing these women thrive with millions of dollars in backing was the ultimate tribute to my father's true legacy, a living, breathing monument to quiet brilliance, finally being given the limitless resources it deserved. While I was authorizing multi-million-dollar grants for women who actually deserved the capital, Malik was currently experiencing a very different type of strictly regulated environment, sitting in a heavily fortified federal penitentiary halfway across the country, serving a mandatory 5-year sentence for interstate wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. He was entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his expensive cologne, wearing a standardized, oversized orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. His days of ordering $1,000 bottles of champagne and charming his way into exclusive high society circles were permanently replaced by the rigid metallic clang of automated cell doors and mandatory cafeteria duty. He spent his heavily monitored recreation hours desperately trying to convince indifferent prison guards that he was secretly a millionaire, caught in a massive legal misunderstanding. but his hollow, arrogant charm held absolutely zero currency in a maximum security facility. His young, pregnant mistress had completely vanished the very moment the federal agents froze his remaining bank accounts, leaving him entirely isolated, with nothing but the crushing reality of his own catastrophic greed. The crushing routine of waking up at dawn to mop concrete floors had completely erased his confident smirk, leaving behind a hollow, broken man who finally realized his manipulative lies could not charm a federal judge. Spencer was faring arguably worse than Malik, completely banished from the financial sector forever by the Securities and Exchange Commission, stripped of his trading licenses and forced into absolute personal bankruptcy. The former self-proclaimed master of the corporate universe was currently standing on the wet, slick concrete of a discount drive-through car wash on the outer industrial edges of the city. Wearing cheap rubber boots and a soaked fluorescent yellow vest, he aggressively scrubbed the hubcaps of a dented minivan. His face perpetually twisted into a deep, bitter scowl as the freezing, soapy water soaked through his thin uniform. He had tried desperately to leverage his old country club connections for a consulting job, but the viral audio recording of his unhinged racist tirade had rendered him completely radioactive. No firm in the country would even allow him past their lobby, security leaving him to violently scrub mud off tires for minimum wage, completely crushed by the undeniable fact that his supposed elite superiority had always been a total fragile illusion every time a luxury vehicle rolled through his wash bay. He was forced to watch successful men living the exact life he had arrogantly thrown away, purely out of his own unchecked jealousy and entitlement. Jocelyn had also entirely vanished from the elite social circles she once believed she ruled, retreating into a dark, dingy, extended-stay motel located directly beside a noisy commercial freight train track. She spent her days peeking nervously through the cheap plastic blinds, jumping at every single heavy footstep in the hallway, terrified that it was either a federal environmental debt collector or our mother, Vivian, desperately trying to track her down to beg for money. Jocelyn had pawned the last of her stolen designer jewelry weeks ago, existing solely on cheap microwave meals and pure paranoid anxiety, completely isolated and actively hiding from the woman who had spent decades enabling her worst impulses. She sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, listening to the deafening roar of the cargo trains rattling her cheap windows, completely paralyzed by the massive $12 million EPA fine that hung over her head like an executioner's blade, knowing that she would spend the rest of her natural life having her meager minimum wage paychecks aggressively garnished by the federal government. I left the foundation headquarters as the sun began to set, stepping into the cool evening air and walking 2 blocks to an exclusive, dimly lit culinary reserve, where a private table was waiting. The atmosphere was incredibly warm, filled with the soft hum of genuine laughter, and the clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses. Sitting around the table were 3 of my closest female colleagues, women who had supported my vision from the very beginning, and sitting directly beside me was Marcus A., brilliant structural engineer I had met during the foundation building renovations. He poured me a glass of vintage red wine, his hand brushing gently against mine, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet respect. He never interrupted me. He never tried to claim credit for my ideas, and he looked at my fierce intelligence with absolute pure admiration rather than toxic insecurity. We spent the evening discussing art, global markets, and architectural theory, the conversation flowing beautifully without a single drop of tension or manufactured drama. For the first time in my entire existence, I was surrounded by people who loved the reality of who I was, rather than what they could extract from my bank accounts. There was no screaming, no emotional manipulation, and absolutely no walking on eggshells, just pure, unadulterated peace. As Marcus smiled at a joke I made, leaning in close to top off my wine, I felt a profound sense of total, absolute security settling deep into my bones. As Marcus leaned back to flag down the waiter for the dessert menu, my secure corporate phone suddenly vibrated heavily against the polished mahogany table. I picked it up casually, expecting a minor update from my late-night analysts, but the screen was glowing intensely with an urgent Tier 1 financial news alert from the Global Market Exchange tracking system. I tapped the notification and felt the breath catch slightly in my throat as I read the headline confirming that a massive, sudden international merger had just finalized in the exact sector I had heavily aggressively targeted, causing my private holding company valuation to violently instantly triple overnight. The glowing screen of my secure corporate phone illuminated the dimly lit culinary reserve, casting a soft blue light across the heavy mahogany table. The notification was undeniable proof that my strategic aggressive market targeting had not just succeeded, it had violently, completely redefined the landscape of my industry, tripling my holding company valuation in a single instant. Marcus noticed the subtle shift in my expression, his hand warm and steady over mine, asking quietly if everything was all right. I looked up from the screen, meeting his deep, respectful gaze and the faces of my three brilliant colleagues, and for the first time in my entire life, I let out a genuine, unfiltered laugh of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was not the hollow, arrogant laughter that my ex-husband used to project, or the mocking, cruel sneer my mother wore like a badge of honor. It was the sound of absolute, total liberation. The sound of a woman who had just conquered the very universe that was explicitly designed to crush her. I slid the phone back into my designer clutch without saying a word, simply raising my vintage red wine to propose a silent toast to the incredible, limitless future we were all building together. The rest of the dinner faded into a beautiful blur of effortless conversation and shared dreams, leaving behind the toxic wreckage of my past. Later that night, after saying goodbye to my friends and sharing a lingering, deeply comforting embrace with Marcus, I stepped into the sleek private car waiting at the curb. The drive back to my luxury penthouse was smooth, the city of Atlanta blurring past the tinted windows like a glittering ocean of endless possibility. The quiet hum of the engine gave me the perfect absolute silence I needed to truly process the magnitude of the last 6 months. My mind wandered back to the dark, suffocating days when I was treated like a disposable asset, a human stepping stone for the ravenous, unearned ambitions of my own flesh and blood. I watched the streetlights wash over the plush interior of the car, feeling a profound detachment from the girl who used to shrink herself just to make her abusers feel towering and important. I had spent my entire existence walking on eggshells, desperately trying to decode the volatile, unpredictable moods of the people who were supposed to protect me. But as the car glided effortlessly through the downtown traffic, I realized that the fear was completely, entirely gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor of self-respect and absolute clarity. I was no longer the frightened scapegoat desperately waiting for a crumb of validation from a mother who only viewed me as an ATM, or a brother-in-law who only viewed me as an obstacle. I was the architect of my own destiny, fully, entirely in control of every single breath I took. When the private elevator doors slid open, revealing the pristine, expansive quiet of my penthouse, I walked slowly across the polished marble floors, kicking off my heels and letting my bare feet ground me in the reality of my new existence. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the world I now commanded. I walked toward the massive window, looking out over the sprawling urban grid, and allowed my thoughts to drift toward the generational trauma I had finally successfully dismantled. Society constantly, relentlessly conditions us to accept abuse from the people who share our DNA. The world constantly demands that we turn the other cheek, that we swallow our pride and our pain and our dignity just to keep the fragile illusion of the family unit intact. They drill it into our heads from the moment we are born, repeating that tired, manipulative phrase over and over again, telling us to forgive family because blood is thicker than water. I leaned my head against the cool glass, realizing just how utterly destructive that absolute lie truly is. Blood might be thicker than water, but poison is also thicker than water, and for 32 years I had been forced to drink it daily, swallowing their toxic greed, their unhinged jealousy, and their merciless manipulation, while silently praying. It would not completely destroy my soul. I chose the cure, and the cure was walking away entirely. The true revelation of this entire brutal journey was discovering what actual wealth really feels like. True wealth is not the multi-million-dollar view, or the bespoke velvet furniture, or the massive, staggering valuation sitting securely in my heavily guarded offshore trusts. Those are simply the tangible byproducts of my survival. The absolute greatest luxury I had finally achieved was peace. The profound, heavy, beautiful peace that only comes from completely, entirely severing the dead weight that had been actively, aggressively dragging me down into the abyss for decades. True wealth is the absolute freedom to walk into your own home and know with complete certainty that no one is waiting in the shadows to scream at you, belittle you, or steal the very foundation you built with your own two bare hands. My ultimate payoff was the silence. The absolute glorious lack of manufactured drama and the total absence of toxic predators masquerading as family members. I did not have to actively, aggressively destroy them. I simply had to step out of their way and let the heavy, crushing weight of their own blinding greed do the absolute violent work for me. They had handed me the matches, and I simply allowed them to burn their own empire down to the ground, while I quietly, confidently walked away into a life they could never possibly comprehend, let alone touch. Every single day, moving forward would be a testament to the undeniable fact that you do not owe your sanity to the people who share your genetics. As I stood there looking out over the horizon, feeling the cool glass against my forehead, a profound sense of closure washed completely over me, concluding the brutal, violent chapter of my past and opening the limitless blank pages of my future. The war was definitively entirely over, and the victor was the exact woman they had spent a lifetime trying to convince was completely invisible. I turned away from the window, walking slowly toward my quiet, dark bedroom, ready to sleep the most peaceful, deeply restorative sleep of my entire life, completely unburdened, completely free, and completely mine. But as I close this chapter, I have to ask you, looking out into the vast digital world, listening to this journey of survival and absolute reckoning, have you ever had to let a toxic family member dig their own grave while you walked away in peace? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't doing anything to them. It's letting their own greed do the work for you. Hit like and subscribe to join a community of survivors who chose themselves. True strength lies in setting firm boundaries and refusing to engage with toxicity even from those closest to you. Jasmine's story proves that you don't need to lower yourself to the level of those who betray you. By maintaining your integrity and intelligence, you often allow their own greed and dishonesty to become their undoing. Real success is found when you prioritize your mental peace over the approval of others, realizing you are not responsible for fixing people who refuse to change. Self-preservation isn't selfishness. It is the vital foundation for your independence. If you have ever bravely chosen your own peace over a toxic situation, hit the like button and share your story with us below.